Chapter 56. We visited all the holy places about Jerusalem, which we had left unvisited when we journeyed to the Jordan, and then, about 3 o'clock one afternoon, we fell into procession and marched out at the stately Damascus gate, and the walls of Jerusalem shut us out forever. We paused on the summit of a distant hill and took a final look and made a final farewell to the venerable city which had been such a good home to us. For about 4 hours we traveled downhill constantly. We followed a narrow bridle path which traversed the beds of the mountain gorges, and when we could we got out of the way of the long trains of laden camels and asses, and when we could not we suffered the misery of being mashed up against perpendicular walls of rock and having our legs bruised by the passing freight. Jack was caught 2 or 3 times, and Dan and Molt as often. One horse had a heavy fall on the slippery rocks, and the others had narrow escapes. However, this was as good a road as we had found in Palestine, and possibly even the best, so there was not much grumbling. Sometimes in the glens we came upon luxuriant orchards of figs, apricots, pomegranates, and such things, but oftener the scenery was rugged, mountainless, verdureless, and forbidding. Here and there towers were perched high up on acclivities which seemed almost inaccessible. This fashion is as old as Palestine itself, and was adopted in ancient times for security against enemies. We crossed the brook which furnished David the stone that killed Goliath, and no doubt we looked upon the very ground whereon that noted battle was fought. We passed by a picturesque old Gothic ruin, whose stone pavements had rung to the armed heels of many a valorous crusader, and we rode through a piece of country which we were told once knew Samson as a citizen. We stayed all night with the good monks at the convent of Ramla, and in the morning got up and galloped the horses and a good part of the distance from there to Jaffa or Joppa, for the plain was as level as a floor and free from stones, and besides this was our last march in Holy Land. These 2 or 3 hours finished, we and the tired horses could have rest and sleep as long as we wanted it. This was the plain of which Joshua spoke when he said, "Sun, stand thou still on Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon." As we drew near to Jaffa, the boys spurred up the horses and indulged in the excitement of an actual race, an experience we had hardly had since we raced on donkeys in the Azores Islands. We finally came to the noble grove of orange trees in which the oriental city of Jaffa lies buried. We passed through the walls and rode again down narrow streets and among swarms of animated rags, and saw other sights and had other experiences we had long been familiar with. We dismounted for the last time, and out in the offing, riding at anchor, we saw the ship. I put an exclamation point there, because we felt one when we saw the vessel. The long pilgrimage was ended, and somehow we seemed to feel glad of it. For description of Jaffa, see Universal Gazetteer. Simon the tanner formerly lived here. We went to his house. All the pilgrims visit Simon the tanner's house. Peter saw the vision of the beasts let down in a sheet when he lay upon the roof of Simon the tanner's house. It was from Jaffa that Jonah sailed when he was told to go and prophesy against Nineveh, and no doubt it was not far from the town that the whale threw him up when he discovered that he had no ticket. Jonah was disobedient, and of a fault-finding, complaining disposition, and deserves to be lightly spoken of, almost. The timbers used in the construction of Solomon's temple were floated to Jaffa in rafts, and the narrow opening in the reef through which they passed to the shore is not an inch wider or a shade less dangerous to navigate than it was then. Such is the sleepy nature of the population Palestine's only good seaport has now and always had. Jaffa has a history and a stirring one. It will not be discovered anywhere in this book. If the reader will call at the circulating library and mention my name, he will be furnished with books which will afford him the fullest information concerning Jaffa. So ends the pilgrimage. We ought to be glad that we did not make it for the purpose of feasting our eyes upon fascinating aspects of nature, for we would have been disappointed, at least at this season of the year. A writer in Life in the Holy Land observes, monotonous and uninviting as much of the Holy Land will appear to persons accustomed to the almost constant verdure of flowers, ample streams, and varied surface of our own country, we must remember that its aspect to the Israelites after the weary march of 40 years through the desert must have been very different. Which all of us will freely grant, but it truly is monotonous and uninviting, and there is no sufficient reason for describing it as being otherwise. Of all the lands there are for dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. The hills are barren, they are dull of color, they are unpicturesque in shape. The valleys are unsightly deserts, fringed with a feeble vegetation that has an expression about it of being sorrowful and despondent. The Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee sleep in the midst of a vast stretch of hill and plain, wherein the eye rests upon no pleasant tint, no striking object, no soft picture dreaming in a purple haze or mottled with the shadows of the clouds. Every outline is harsh, every feature is distinct, there is no perspective. Distance works no enchantment here. It is a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. Small shreds and patches of it must be very beautiful in the full flush of spring, however, and all the more beautiful by contrast with the far-reaching desolation that surrounds them on every side. I would much like to see the fringes of the Jordan in springtime, and Shechem and Israelidon, and Ajalon and the borders of Galilee, but even then these spots would seem mere toy gardens set at wide intervals in the waste of a limitless desolation. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. It broods over the spell of a curse that has withered its fields and fettered its energies. Where Sodom and Gomorrah are reared their domes and towers, that solemn sea now floods the plain, in whose bitter waters no living thing exists, over whose waveless surface and the blistering air hangs motionless and dead, about whose borders nothing grows but weeds and scattering tufts of cane, and that treacherous fruit that promises refreshment to parching lips, but turns to ashes at the touch. Nazareth is forlorn. About that ford of Jordan where the hosts of Israel entered the promised land with songs of rejoicing, one finds only a squalid camp of fantastic Bedouins of the desert. Jericho the accursed lies a moldering ruin today, even as Joshua's miracle left it more than 3,000 years ago. Bethlehem and Bethany, in their poverty and their humiliation, have nothing about them now to remind one that they once knew the high honor of the Savior's presence. The hallowed spot where the shepherds watched their flocks by night, and where the angels sang peace on earth, goodwill to men, is untenanted by any living creature, and unblessed by any feature that is pleasant to the eye. Renowned Jerusalem itself, the stateliest name in history, has lost all its ancient grandeur and become a pauper village. The riches of Solomon are no longer there to compel the admiration of visiting Oriental queens. The wonderful temple, which was the pride and the glory of Israel, is gone, and the Ottoman crescent is lifted above the spot where, on that most memorable day in the annals of the world, they reared the Holy Cross. The noted Sea of Galilee, where the Roman fleets once rode at anchor, and the disciples of the Savior sailed in their ships, was long ago deserted by the devotees of war and commerce, and its borders are a silent wilderness. Capernaum is a shapeless ruin. Magdala is the home of beggared Arabs. Bethsaida and Chorazin have vanished from the earth, and the desert places round them, where thousands of men once listened to the Saviour's voice and ate the miraculous bread, sleep in the hush of a solitude that is inhabited only by birds of prey and skulking foxes. Palestine is desolate and unlovely, and why should it be otherwise? Can the curse of the deity beautify a land? Palestine is no more of this workday world. It is sacred to poetry and tradition. It is dreamland. Chapter 57. It was worth a kingdom to be at sea again. It was a relief to drop all anxiety whatsoever, all questions as to where we should go, how long we should stay, whether it were worthwhile to go or not, all anxieties about the condition of the horses, all such questions as, shall we ever get to water? Shall we ever lunch? Ferguson, how many more million miles have we got to creep under this awful sun before we camp? It was a relief to cast all these torturing little anxieties far away. Ropes of steel they were, and every one with a separate and distinct strain on it, and feel the temporary contentment that is born of the banishment of all care and responsibility. We did not look at the compass, we did not care now where the ship went to, so that she went out of sight of land as quickly as possible. When I travel again, I wish to go in a pleasure ship. No amount of money could have purchased for us, in a strange vessel and among unfamiliar faces, the perfect satisfaction and the sense of being at home again, which we experienced when we stepped on board the Quaker City, our own ship, after this wearisome pilgrimage. It is something we have felt always when we return to her, and something we had no desire to sell. We took off our blue woolen shirts, our spurs and heavy boots, our sanguinary revolvers, and our buckskin-seated pantaloons, and got shaved and came out in Christian costume once more, all but Jack, who changed all the other articles of his dress, but clung to his traveling pantaloons. They still preserved their ample buckskin seat intact, and so his short pea jacket and his long, thin legs assisted to make him a picturesque object whenever he stood on the forecastle looking abroad upon the ocean over the bows. At such times his father's last injunction suggested itself to me. He said, "Jack, my boy, you are about to go among a brilliant company of gentlemen and ladies, who are refined and cultivated and thoroughly accomplished in the manners and customs of good society. Listen to their conversation, study their habits of life, and learn. Be polite and obliging to all, and considerate to everyone's opinions, failings, and prejudices. Command the just respect of all your fellow voyagers, even though you fail to win their friendly regard. And Jack, don't you ever dare, while you live, appear in public on those decks in fair weather, in a costume unbecoming your mother's drawing room." It would have been worth any price if the father of this hopeful youth could have stepped on board sometime and seen him standing high on the forecastle, pea jacket, tasseled red fez, buckskin patch and all, placidly contemplating the ocean, a rare spectacle for anybody's drawing room. After a pleasant voyage and a good rest, we drew near to Egypt, and out of the mellowest of sunsets we saw the domes and minarets of Alexandria rise into view. As soon as the anchor was down, Jack and I got a boat and went ashore. It was night by this time, and the other passengers were content to remain at home and visit ancient Egypt after breakfast. It was the way they did at Constantinople. They took a lively interest in new countries, but their schoolboy impatience had worn off, and they had learned that it was wisdom to take things easy and go along comfortably. These old countries did not go away in the night. They stayed till after breakfast. When we reached the pier, we found an army of Egyptian boys with donkeys no larger than themselves, waiting for passengers. For donkeys are the omnibuses of Egypt. We preferred to walk, but we could not have our own way. The boys crowded about us, clamored around us, and slewed their donkeys exactly across our path. No matter which way we turned, they were good-natured rascals, and so were the donkeys. We mounted, and the boys ran behind us, and kept the donkeys in a furious gallop, as is the fashion at Damascus. I believe I would rather ride a donkey than any beast in the world. He goes briskly, he puts on no airs, he is docile though opinionated. Satan himself could not scare him, and he is convenient, very convenient. When you are tired riding, you can rest your feet on the ground and let him gallop from under you. We found the hotel and secured rooms, and were happy to know that the Prince of Wales had stopped there once. They had it everywhere on signs. No other princes had stopped there since, till Jack and I came. We went abroad through the town then, and found it a city of huge commercial buildings and broad, handsome streets, brilliant with gaslight. By night it was a sort of reminiscence of Paris, but finally Jack found an ice cream saloon, and that closed investigations for that evening. The weather was very hot, and it had been many a day since Jack had seen ice cream, and so it was useless to talk of leaving the saloon till it shut up. In the morning, the lost tribes of America came ashore and infested the hotels and took possession of all the donkeys and other open barouches that offered. They went in picturesque procession to the American consuls, to the Great Garden, to Cleopatra's Needles, to Pompey's Pillar, to the palace of the Viceroy of Egypt, to the Nile, to the superb groves of date palms. One of our most inveterate relic hunters had his hammer with him, and tried to break a fragment off the upright needle, and could not do it. He tried the prostate one and failed. He borrowed a heavy sledgehammer from a mason and tried again. He tried Pompey's Pillar, and this baffled him. Scattered all about the mighty monolith were sphinxes of noble countenance, carved out of Egyptian granite as hard as blue steel, and whose shapely features the wear of 5,000 years had failed to mark or mar. The relic hunter battered at these persistently, and sweated profusely over his work. He might as well have attempted to deface the moon. They regarded him serenely with the stately smile they had worn so long, and which seemed to say, "Peck away, poor insect. We were not made to fear such as you. In 10 dragging ages we have seen more of your kind than there are sands at your feet. Have they left a blemish upon us?" But I am forgetting the Jaffa colonists. At Jaffa we had taken on board some 40 members of a very celebrated community. They were male and female, babies, young boys and young girls, young married people, and some who had passed a shade beyond the prime of life. I refer to the Adams Jaffa colony. Others had deserted before. We left in Jaffa Mr. Adams, his wife, and 15 unfortunates who not only had no money, but did not know where to turn or whither to go. Such was the statement made to us. Our 40 were miserable enough in the first place, and they lay about the decks seasick all the voyage, which about completed their misery, I take it. However, one or two young men remained upright, and by constant persecution we wormed out of them some little information. They gave it reluctantly and in a very fragmentary condition, for, having been shamefully humbugged by their prophet, they felt humiliated and unhappy. In such circumstances, people did not like to talk. The colony was a complete fiasco. I have already said that such as could get away did so, from time to time. The prophet Adams, once an actor, then several other things, afterwards a Mormon and a missionary, always an adventurer, remains at Jaffa with his handful of sorrowful subjects. The 40 we brought away with us were chiefly destitute, though not all of them. They wished to get to Egypt. What might become of them when they did not know and probably did not care? Then they probably did not care. Anything to get away from hated Jaffa. They had little to hope for, because after many appeals to the sympathies of New England made by strangers of Boston through the newspapers, and after the establishment of an office there for the reception of moneyed contributions for the Jaffa colonists, $1 was subscribed. The Consul General for Egypt showed me the newspaper paragraph which mentioned the circumstances and mentioned also their discontinuance of the effort and the closing of the office. It was evident that practical New England was not sorry to be rid of such visionaries, and was not in the least inclined to hire anybody to bring them back to her. Still, to get to Egypt was something, in the eyes of the unfortunate colonists, hopeless as the prospect seemed of ever getting further. Thus circumstanced, they landed at Alexandria from our ship. One of our passengers, Mr. Moses S. Beach of the New York Sun, inquired of the Consul General what it would cost to send these people to their home in Maine by the way of Liverpool, and he said $1,500 in gold would do it. Mr. Beach gave his check for the money, and so the troubles of the Jaffa colonists were at an end. It was an unselfish act of benevolence. It was done without any ostentation, and has never been mentioned in any newspaper, I think. Therefore, it is refreshing to learn, now several months after the above narrative was written, that another man received all the credit of this rescue of the colonists. Such is life. Alexandria was too much like a European city to be novel, and we soon tired of it. We took the cars and came up here to ancient Cairo, which is an oriental city and of the completest pattern. There is little about it to disabuse one's mind of the error if he should take it into his head that he was in the heart of Arabia. Stately camels and dromedaries, swarthy Egyptians, and likewise Turks and black Ethiopians, turbaned, sashed, and blazoned in a rich variety of oriental costumes, of all shades of flashy colors, are what one sees on every hand, crowding around the narrow streets and the honeycombed bazaars. We are stopping at Shepherd's Hotel, which is the worst on earth, except the one I stopped at once in a small town in the United States. It is pleasant to read this sketch in my notebook now, and know that I can stand Shepherd's Hotel sure, because I have been in one just like it in America and survived. I stopped at the Benton House. It used to be a good hotel, but that proves nothing. I used to be a good boy, for that matter. Both of us have lost character of late years. The Benton is not a good hotel. The Benton lacks a very great deal of being a good hotel. Perdition is full of better hotels than the Benton. It was late at night when I got there, and I told the clerk I would like plenty of lights, because I wanted to read an hour or two. When I reached number 15 with the porter, we came along a dim hall that was clad in ancient carpeting, faded, worn out in many places, and patched with old scraps of oil cloth, a hall that sank under one's feet and creaked dismally to every footstep. He struck a light, 2 inches of sallow, sorrowful, consumptive tallow candle that burned blue and sputtered and got discouraged and went out. The porter lit it again, and I asked if that was all the light the clerk sent. He said, "Oh no, I've got another one here," and he produced another couple inches of tallow candle. I said, "Light them both. I'll have the one to see the other by." He did it, but the result was drearier than darkness itself. He was a cheery, accommodating rascal. He said he would go somewheres and steal a lamp. I abetted and encouraged him in his criminal design. I heard the landlord get after him in the hall 10 minutes afterward. "Where are you going with that lamp?" 15 wants it, sir." 15? Why, he's got a double lot of candles. Does the man want to illuminate the house? Does he want to get up a torchlight procession? What is he up to, anyhow? He don't like them candles. Says he wants a lamp. Why, what in the nation does... Why, I never heard of such a thing. What on earth can he want with that lamp? Well, he only wants to read. That's what he says. Wants to read, does he? Ain't satisfied with 1,000 candles, but has to have a lamp? I do wonder what the devil that fellow wants that lamp for. Take him another candle, and then if... But he wants the lamp. Says he'll burn the old house down if he don't get a lamp. A remark which I never made. I'd like to see him at once. Well, you take it along. But I swear it beats my time, though, and see if you can't find out what in the very nation he wants with that lamp. And he went off growling to himself and still wondering and wondering over the unaccountable conduct of number 15. The lamp was a good one, but it revealed some disagreeable things. A bed in the suburbs of a desert of room, a bed that had hills and valleys in it. And you'd have to accommodate your body to the impression left in it by the man that slept there last, before you could lie comfortably. A carpet that had seen better days, a melancholy washstand in a remote corner, and a dejected pitcher on it, sorrowing over a broken nose. A looking-glass split across the center, which chopped your head off at the chin and made you look like some dreadful, unfinished monster or other, the paper peeling in shreds from the walls. I sighed and said, "This is charming, and now don't you think you could get me something to read?" The porter said, "Oh, certainly, the old man's got dead loads of books," and he was gone before I could tell him what sort of literature I would rather have. And yet his countenance expressed the utmost confidence in his ability to execute the commission with credit to himself. The old man made a descent on him. "What are you going to do with that pile of books?" 15 wants 'em, sir. 15, is it? He'll want a warming pan next. He'll want a nurse. Take him everything there is in the house. Take him the barkeeper. Take him the baggage wagon. Take him a chambermaid. Confound me, I never saw anything like it. What did he say he wants with those books?" "Wants to read 'em, like enough. It ain't likely he wants to eat 'em, I don't reckon." "Wants to read 'em? Wants to read 'em this time of night? The infernal lunatic? Well, he can't have them." "But he says he's morally bound to have them. He says he'll just go a-raring and a-charging through this house and raise more. Well, there's no telling what he won't do if he don't get 'em, 'cause he's drunk and crazy and desperate. And nothing will soothe him down but them cussed books." I had not made any threats, and was not in the condition ascribed to me by the porter. "Well, go on, but I'll be around when he goes to raring and charging, and the first rare he makes, I'll make him rare out of the window." And then the old gentleman went off, growling as before. The genius of that porter was something wonderful. He put an armful of books on the bed and said, "Good night," as confidently as if he knew perfectly well that those books were exactly my style of reading matter. And well he might. His selection covered the whole range of legitimate literature. It comprised The Great Consummation by Reverend Dr. Cummins, theology, revised statutes of the state of Missouri, law, the complete horse doctor, medicine, the Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo, romance, the works of William Shakespeare, poetry. I shall never cease to admire the tact and the intelligence of that gifted porter. But all the donkeys in Christendom and most of the Egyptian boys, I think, are at the door, and there is some noise going on. Not to put it in stronger language, we are about to start into the illustrious pyramids of Egypt, and the donkeys for the voyage are under inspection. I will go and select one before the choice animals are all taken. Chapter 58. The donkeys were all good, all handsome, all strong and in good condition, all fast and all willing to prove it. They were the best we had found anywhere, and the most recher. I do not know what recher is, but that is what these donkeys were, anyhow. Some were of a soft mouse color, and the others were white, black, and varicolored. Some of them were close-shaven all over, except that a tuft like a paintbrush was left on the end of the tail. Others were so shaven in fanciful landscape garden patterns as to mark their bodies with curving lines, which were bounded on one side by hair and on the other by the close plush left by the shears. They had all been newly barbered and were exceedingly stylish. Several of the white ones were barred like zebras with rainbow stripes of blue and red and yellow paint. These were indescribably gorgeous. Dan and Jack selected from this lot because they brought back Italian reminiscence of the old masters. The saddles were the high, stuffy, frog-shaped things we had known in Ephesus and Smyrna. The donkey boys were lively young Egyptian rascals who could follow a donkey and keep him in a half-canter half a day without tiring. We had plenty of spectators when we mounted, for the hotel was full of English people bound overland to India and officers getting ready for the African campaign against the Abyssinian king Theodorus. We were not a very large party, but as we charged through the streets of the great metropolis, we made noise for 500 and displayed activity and created excitement in proportion. Nobody can steer a donkey, and some collided with camels, dervishes, effendis, asses, beggars, and everything else that offered to the donkeys a reasonable chance for collision. When we turned into the broad avenue that leads out of the city toward Old Cairo, there was plenty of room. The walls of stately date palms that fenced the gardens and bordered the way threw their shadows down and made the air cool and bracing. We rose to the spirit of the time, and the race became a wild rout, a stampede, a terrific panic. I wished to live to enjoy it again. Somewhere along this route we had a few startling exhibitions of oriental simplicity. A girl, apparently 13 years of age, came along the great thoroughfare, dressed like Eve before the fall. We would have called her 13 at home, but here girls who look 13 are often not more than 9 in reality. Occasionally we saw stark naked men of superb build, bathing and making no attempt at concealment. However, an hour's acquaintance with this cheerful custom reconciled the pilgrims to it, and then it ceased to occasion remark. Thus easily do even the most startling novelties grow tame and spiritless to these sight-surfeited wanderers. Arrived at Old Cairo, the camp followers took up the donkeys and tumbled them bodily aboard a small boat with a lateen sail, and we followed and got under way. The deck was closely packed with donkeys and men. The 2 sailors had to climb over and under and through the wedged masts to work the sails, and the steersman had to crowd 4 or 5 donkeys out of the way whenever he wished to swing his tiller and put his helm hard down. But what were their troubles to us? We had nothing to do but enjoy the trip. Nothing to do but shove the donkeys off our corns and look at the charming scenery of the Nile. On the island at our right was the machine they call the Nilometer, a stone column whose business is to mark the rise of the river and prophesy whether it will reach only 32 feet and produce a famine, or whether it will properly flood the land at 40 and produce plenty, or whether it will rise to 43 and bring death and destruction to flocks and crops. But how it does all this, they could not explain to us so that we could understand. On the same island is still shown the spot where Pharaoh's daughter found Moses in the bulrushes. Near the spot we sailed from, the Holy Family dwelt when they sojourned in Egypt, till Herod should complete his slaughter of the innocents. The same tree they rested under when they first arrived was there a short time ago, but the Viceroy of Egypt sent it to the Empress Eugenie lately. He was just in time, otherwise our pilgrims would have had it. The Nile at this point is muddy, swift, and turbid, and does not lack a great deal of being as wide as the Mississippi. We scrambled up the steep bank at the shabby town of Gizeh, mounted the donkeys again, and scampered away. 4 or 5 miles of the route lay along a high embankment, which they say is to be the bed of a railway the Sultan means to build for no other reason than that when the Empress of the French comes to visit him, she can go to the pyramids in comfort. This is true Oriental hospitality. I am very glad it is our privilege to have donkeys instead of cars. At the distance of a few miles, the pyramids rising above the plains looked very clean cut, very grand and imposing, and very soft and filmy as well. They swam in a rich haze that took from them all suggestions of unfeeling stone, and made them seem only the airy nothings of a dream. Structures which might blossom into tiers of vague arches or ornate colonnades, maybe, and change again into all graceful forms of architecture while we looked, and then melt deliciously away and blend with the tremulous atmosphere. At the end of the levee, we left the mules and went in a sailboat across an arm of the Nile with an overflow, and landed where the sands of the Great Sahara still left their embankment, as straight as a wall, along the verge of the alluvial plain of the river. A laborious walk in the flaming sun brought us to the foot of the Great Pyramid of Cheops. It was a fairer vision no longer. It was a corrugated, unsightly mountain of stone. Each of its monstrous sides was a wide stairway which rose upward, step above step, narrowing as it went, till it tapered to a point far aloft in the air. Insect men and women, pilgrims from the Quaker city, were creeping about its dizzying perches, and one little black swarm were waving postage stamps in the airy summit. Handkerchiefs will be understood. Of course, we were besieged by a rabble of muscular Egyptians and Arabs who wanted the contract of dragging us to the top. All tourists are. Of course, you could not hear your own voice for the din that was around you. Of course, the sheikhs said they were the only responsible parties, that all contracts must be made with them. All monies paid over to them, and none exacted from us by any but themselves alone. Of course, they contracted that the varlets who dragged us up should not mention bucksheesh once, for such is the usual routine. Of course, we contracted with them, paid them, were delivered into the hands of the draggers, dragged up the pyramids, and harried and bedeviled for bucksheesh from the foundation clear to the summit. We paid it, too, for we were purposely spread very far apart over the vast side of the pyramid. There was no help near if we called, and the Herculeses who dragged us had a way of asking sweetly and flatteringly for bucksheesh, which was seductive, and of looking fierce and threatening to throw us down the precipice, which was persuasive and convincing. Each step being full as high as a dinner table, there being very, very many of the steps, an Arab having hold of each of our arms and springing upward from step to step and snatching us with them, forcing us to lift our feet as high as our breasts every time, and do it rapidly and keep it up till we were ready to faint. Who shall say it is not lively, exhilarating, lacerating, muscle-straining, bone-wrenching, and perfectly excruciating and exhausting pastime climbing the pyramids? I beseeched the varlets not to twist all my joints asunder. I iterated, reiterated, and even swore to them that I did not wish to beat anybody to the top. Did all I could to convince them that if I got there the last of all, I would feel blessed above men and grateful to them forever. I begged them, prayed them, pleaded with them to let me stop and rest a moment. Only one little moment. And they only answered with some more frightful springs, and unenlisted volunteer behind opened a bombardment of determined boosts with his head which threatened to batter my whole political economy to wreck and ruin. Twice, for 1 minute, they let me rest while they extorted bucksheesh and then continued their maniac flight up the pyramid. They wished to beat the other parties. It was nothing to them that I, a stranger, must be sacrificed upon the altar of their unholy ambition. But in the midst of sorrow, joy blooms. Even in this dark hour I had a sweet consolation, for I knew that except these Mohammedans repented, they would go straight to perdition some day. And they never repent, they never forsake their paganism. This thought calmed me, cheered me, and I sank down, limp and exhausted, upon the summit, but happy, so happy and serene within. On the one hand, a mighty sea of yellow sand stretched away toward the ends of the earth, solemn, silent, shorn of vegetation, its solitude uncheered by any forms of creature life, or on the other, the Eden of Egypt was spread below us, a broad, green floor, cloven by the sinuous river, dotted with villages, its vast distances measured and marked by the diminishing stature of receding clusters of palms. It lay asleep in an enchanted atmosphere. There was no sound, no motion. Above the date plumes in the middle distance swelled a domed and pinnacled mast, glimmering through a tinted, exquisite mist. Away toward the horizon, a dozen shapely pyramids watched over ruined Memphis, and at our feet the bland, impassible Sphinx looked out upon the picture from her throne in the sands as placidly and pensively as she had looked upon its like full 50 lagging centuries ago. We suffered torture no pen can describe from the hungry appeals for bucksheesh that gleamed from Arab eyes and poured incessantly from Arab lips. Why try to call up the traditions of vanished Egyptian grandeur? Why try to fancy Egypt following the dead Ramesses to his tomb in the pyramid, or the long multitude of Israel departing over the desert yonder? Why try to think at all? The thing was impossible. One must bring his meditations cut and dried, or else cut and dry them afterwards. The traditional Arab proposed, in the traditional way, to run down Cheops, cross the eighth of a mile of sand, intervening it and between it and the tall pyramids of Cephron, ascend to Cephron's summit and return to us on top of the Cheops, all in 9 minutes by the watch, and the whole service to be rendered for $1. In the first flush of irritation, I said, let the Arab and his exploits go to the mischief, but stay. The upper third of Cephron was coated with dressed marble, smooth as glass. A blessed thought entered my brain. He must infallibly break his neck. Close the contract with dispatch, I said, and let him go. He started. We watched. He went bounding down the vast broadside, spring after spring, like an ibex. He grew small and smaller till he became a bobbing pygmy away down toward the bottom, then disappeared. We turned and peered over the other side 40 seconds, 80 seconds, 100. Happiness, he is dead already. 2 minutes and a quarter. There he goes. Too true. It was too true. He was very small now. Gradually but surely, he overcame the level ground. He began to spring and climb again. Up, up, up. At last, he reached the smooth coating. Now for it. but he clung to it with toes and fingers like a fly. He crawled this way and that, away to the right, slanting upward, away to the left, still slanting upward, and stood at last, a black pet leg on the summit, and waved his pygmy scarf. Then he crept downward to the raw steps again, then picked up his agile heels and flew. We lost him presently, but presently again we saw him under us, mounting with undiminished energy. Shortly he bounded into our midst with a gallant war whoop. Time, 8 minutes 41 seconds. He had won. His bones were intact. It was a failure. I reflected. I said to myself, he is tired and must grow dizzy. I will risk another dollar on him. He started again, made the trip again, slipped on the smooth coating. I almost had him, but an infamous crevice saved him. He was with us once more, perfectly sound. Time, 8 minutes 46 seconds. I said to Dan, lend me $1. I can beat this game yet. Worse and worse. He won again. Time, 8 minutes 48 seconds. I was all out of patience now. I was desperate. Money was no longer of any consequence. I said, Sirrah, I will give you $100 to jump off this pyramid head first. If you do not like the terms, name your bet. I scorn to stand on expenses now. I will stay right here and risk money on you as long as Dan has got a cent. I was in a fair way to win now, for it was a dazzling opportunity for an Arab. He pondered a moment and would have done it, I think, but his mother arrived then and interfered. Her tears moved me. I could never look upon the tears of woman with indifference, and I said I would give her $100 to jump off too. But it was a failure. The Arabs are too high priced in Egypt. They put on airs unbecoming to such savages. We descended hot and out of humor. The dragoman lit candles, and we all entered a hole near the base of the pyramid, attended by a crazy rabble of Arabs who thrust their services upon us uninvited. They dragged us up a long inclined chute and dripped candle grease all over us. This chute was not more than twice as wide and high as a Saratoga trunk, and was walled, roofed, and floored with solid blocks of Egyptian granite, as wide as a wardrobe, twice as thick and 3 times as long. We kept on climbing through the oppressive gloom till I thought we ought to be nearing the top of the pyramid again, and then came to the Queen's chamber, and shortly to the chamber of the King. These large apartments were tombs. The walls were built of monstrous masses of smoothed granite, neatly joined together. Some of them were nearly as square as an ordinary parlor. A great stone sarcophagus, like a bathtub, stood in the center of the king's chamber. Around it were gathered a picturesque group of Arab savages and soiled and tattered pilgrims, who held their candles aloft in the gloom while they chattered, and the winking blurs of light shed a dim glory down upon one of the irrepressible memento seekers, who was pecking at the venerable sarcophagus with his sacrilegious hammer. We struggled out to the open air and the bright sunshine, and for the space of 30 minutes received ragged Arabs by couples, dozens, and platoons, and paid them bucksheesh for services they swore and proved by each other that they had rendered, but which we had not been aware of before. And as each party was paid, they dropped into the rear of the procession and in due time arrived again with a newly invented delinquent list for liquidation. We lunched in the shade of the pyramid, and in the midst of this encroaching and unwelcome company, and then Dan and Jack and I started away for a walk. A howling swarm of beggars followed us, surrounded us, almost headed us off. A sheik in flowing white bornos and gaudy headgear was with them. He wanted more bucksheesh, but we had adopted a new code. It was millions for defense, but not a cent for bucksheesh. I asked him if he could persuade the others to depart if we paid him. He said yes, for 10 francs. We accepted the contract and said, "Now persuade your vassals to fall back." He swung his long staff around his head, and 3 Arabs bit the dust. He capered among the mob like a very maniac. His blows fell like hail, and whenever one fell, the subject went down. We had to hurry to the rescue and tell him it was only necessary to damage them a little. He need not kill them. In 2 minutes we were alone with the sheik, and remained so. The persuasive powers of this illiterate savage were remarkable. Each side of the Pyramid of Cheops is about as long as the Capitol at Washington, or the Sultan's new palace on the Bosphorus, and is longer than the greatest depth of St. Peter's at Rome, which is to say that each side of Cheops extends 700 and some odd feet. It is about 75 feet higher than the cross on St. Peter's. The first time I ever went down the Mississippi, I thought the highest bluff on the river between St. Louis and New Orleans, it was near Selma, Missouri, was probably the highest mountain in the world. It is 413 feet high. It still looms in my memory with undiminished grandeur. I can see the trees and bushes growing smaller and smaller as I followed them up its huge slant with my eye, till they became a feathery fringe on the distant summit. This symmetrical pyramid of Cheops, this solid mountain of stone reared by the patient hands of men, this mighty tomb of a forgotten monarch, dwarfs my cherished mountain, for it is 480 feet high. In still earlier years than those I have been recalling, Holliday's Hill in our town was to me the noblest work of God. It appeared to pierce the skies. It was nearly 300 feet high. In those days I pondered the subject much, but I never could understand why it did not swathe its summit with never failing clouds, and crown its majestic brow with everlasting snows. I had heard that such was the custom of great mountains in other parts of the world. I remembered how I worked with another boy at odd afternoons, stolen from study and paid for with stripes, to undermine and start from its bed an immense boulder that rested upon the edge of that hilltop. I remembered how one Saturday afternoon we gave 3 hours of honest effort to the task, and saw at last that our reward was at hand. I remembered how we sat down then and wiped the perspiration away, and waited to let a picnic party get out of the way in the road below, and then we started the boulder. It was splendid. It went crashing down the hillside, tearing up saplings, mowing bushes down like grass, ripping and crushing and smashing everything in its path, eternally splintered and scattered a woodpile at the foot of the hill, and then sprang from the high bank clear over a dray in the road. The Negro glanced up once and dodged, and the next second it made infinitesimal mincemeat of a frame cooper shop, and the coopers swarmed out like bees. Then we said it was perfectly magnificent, and left, because the coopers were starting up the hill to inquire. Still, that mountain, prodigious as it was nothing to the Pyramid of Cheops. I could conjure up no comparison that would convey to my mind a satisfactory comprehension of the magnitude of a pile of monstrous stones that covered 13 acres of ground and stretched upward 480 tiresome feet, and so I gave it up and walked down to the Sphinx. After years of waiting, it was before me at last. The great face was so sad, so earnest, so longing, so patient. There was a dignity not of earth in its mien, and in its countenance a benignity as such as never any human thing wore. It was stone, but it seemed sentient. If ever image of stone thought, it was thinking. It was looking toward the verge of the landscape, yet looking at nothing but distance and vacancy. It was looking over and beyond everything of the present, and far into the past. It was gazing out over the ocean of time, over lines of century waves, which, further and further receding, closed nearer and nearer together, and blended at last into one unbroken tide, away toward the horizon of remote antiquity. It was thinking of the wars of departed ages, of the empires it had seen, created, and destroyed, of the nations whose birth it had witnessed, whose progress it had watched, whose annihilation it had noted, of the joy and sorrow, the life and death, the grandeur and decay of 5,000 slow revolving years. It was the type of an attribute of man, of a faculty of his heart and brain. It was memory, retrospection, wrought into visible, tangible form. All who know what pathos there is in memories of days that are accomplished and faces that have vanished, albeit only a trifling score of years gone by, will have some appreciation of the pathos that dwells in these grave eyes that look so steadfastly back upon the things they knew before history was born, before tradition had been, things that were and forms that moved, in a vague era which even poetry and romance scarce know of, and passed one by one away and left the stony dreamer solitary in the midst of a strange new age and uncomprehended scenes. The Sphinx is grand in its loneliness. It is imposing in its magnitude. It is impressive in the mystery that hangs over its story. And there is that in the overshadowing majesty of this eternal figure of stone, with its accusing memory of the deeds of all ages, which reveals to one something of what he shall feel when he shall stand at the last in the awful presence of God. There are some things which, for the credit of America, should be left unsaid, perhaps, but these very things happen sometimes to be the very things which, for the real benefit of Americans, ought to have prominent notice. While we stood looking, a wart or an excrescence of some kind appeared on the jaw of the Sphinx. We heard the familiar clink of a hammer and understood the case at once. One of our well-meaning reptiles, relic hunters, had crawled up there and was trying to break a specimen from the face of this, the most majestic creation the hand of man has wrought. But the great image contemplated the dead ages as calmly as ever, unconscious of the small insect that was fretting at its jaw. Egyptian granite that has defied the storms and earthquakes of all time has nothing to fear from the tack hammers of ignorant excursionists, highwaymen like this specimen. He failed in his enterprise. We sent a sheikh to arrest him if he had the authority, or to warn him if he had not, that by the laws of Egypt the crime he was attempting to commit was punishable with imprisonment or the bastinado. Then he desisted and went away. The Sphinx, 125 feet long, 60 feet high, and 102 feet around the head, if I remember rightly, carved out of one solid block of stone harder than any iron. The block must have been as large as the Fifth Avenue Hotel before the usual waste, by the necessities of sculpture, of a fourth or a half of the original mass was begun. I only set down these figures and these remarks to suggest the prodigious labor the carving of it so elegantly, so symmetrically, so faultlessly must have cost. This species of stone is so hard that figures cut in it remain sharp and unmarred after exposure to the weather for 2,000 or 3,000 years. Now, did it take 100 years of patient toil to carve the Sphinx? It seems probable. Something interfered, and we did not visit the Red Sea and walk upon the sands of Arabia. I shall not describe the great mosque of Mehemet Ali, whose entire inner walls are built of polished and glistening alabaster. I shall not tell how the little birds have built their nests in the globes of the great chandeliers that hang in the mosque, and how they fill the whole place with their music and are not afraid of anybody because their audacity is pardoned, their rights are respected, and nobody is allowed to interfere with them, even though the mosque be thus doomed to go unlighted. I certainly shall not tell the hackneyed story of the massacre of the Mamelukes, because I am glad the lawless rascals were massacred, and I do not wish to get up any sympathy in their behalf. I shall not tell how that one solitary Mameluke jumped his horse 100 feet down from the battlements of the citadel and escaped, because I do not think much of that. I could have done it myself. I shall not tell of Joseph's well, which he dug in the solid rock of the citadel hill, and which is as good as new, still as good as new, nor how the same mules he brought to draw up the water with an endless chain are still at it yet and are getting tired of it too. I shall not tell about Joseph's granaries, which he built to store the grain in, what time the English brokers were selling short, unwitting that there would be no corn in all the land when it should be time for them to deliver. I shall not tell anything about the strange, strange city of Cairo, because it is only a repetition, a good deal intensified and exaggerated, of the Oriental cities I have already spoken of. I shall not tell of the great caravan which leaves from Mecca every year, for I did not see it, nor of the fashion of the people have of prostrating themselves and so forming a long human pavement to be ridden over by the chief of the expedition on its return, to the end that their salvation may be thus secured, for I did not see that either. I shall not speak of the railway, for it is like any other railway. I shall only say that the fuel they use for the locomotive is composed of mummies 3,000 years old, purchased by the ton or by the graveyard for that purpose, and that sometimes one hears the profane engineer call out pettishly, "Damn these plebeians, they don't burn with a cent. Pass out a king," stated to me for a fact. I only tell it as I got it. I am willing to believe it. I can believe anything. I shall not tell of the groups of mud cones stuck like wasps' nests upon 1,000 mounds above high water mark, the length and breadth of Egypt, villages of the lower classes. I shall not speak of the boundless sweep of level plain, green with luxuriant grain, that gladdens the eye as far as it can pierce through the soft, rich atmosphere of Egypt. I shall not speak of the vision of the pyramids seen at a distance of 5 and 20 miles, for the picture is too ethereal to be limned by an uninspired pen. I shall not tell of the crowds of dusky women who flocked to the cars when they stopped a moment at a station to sell us a drink of water or a ruddy, juicy pomegranate. I shall not tell of the motley multitudes and wild costumes that graced the fair we found in full blast at another barbarous station. I shall not tell how we feasted on fresh dates and enjoyed the pleasant landscape all through the flying journey, nor how we thundered into Alexandria at last, swarmed out of the cars, rowed aboard the ship, left a comrade behind, who was to return to Europe and thence home, raised the anchor and turned our bows homeward finally and forever from the long voyage, nor how, as the mellow sun went down upon the oldest land on earth, Jack and Moult assembled in solemn state in the smoking room, and mourned over the lost comrade the whole night, and would not be comforted. I shall not speak a word of any of these things, or write a line. They shall be as a sealed book. I do not know what a sealed book is, because I never saw one, but a sealed book is the expression to use in this connection, because it is popular. We were glad to have seen the land which was the mother of civilization, which taught Greece her letters, and through Greece Rome, and through Rome the world, the land which could have humanized and civilized the hapless children of Israel, but allowed them to depart out of her borders little better than savages. We were glad to have seen that land which had an enlightened religion with future eternal rewards and punishment in it, while even Israel's religion contained no promise of a hereafter. We were glad to have seen that land which had glass 3,000 years before England had it, and could paint upon it as none of us can paint now. That land which knew, 3,000 years ago, well nigh all of medicine and surgery which science has discovered lately, which had all those curious surgical instruments which science has invented recently, which had in high excellence 1,000 luxuries and necessities of an advanced civilization, which we have gradually contrived and accumulated in modern times, and claimed as things that were new under the sun, that had paper untold centuries before we dreamt of it, and waterfalls before our women thought of them, that had a perfect system of common schools so long before we boasted of our achievements in that direction that it seems forever and forever ago, that so embalmed the dead that flesh was made almost immortal, which we cannot do, and that built temples which mock at destroying time and smile grimly upon our lauded little prodigies of architecture, that old land that knew all which we know now, perchance, and more, that walked in the broad highway of civilization in the gray dawn of creation, ages and ages before we were born, that left the impress of exalted, cultivated mind upon the eternal front of the Sphinx to confound all scoffers who, when all her other proofs had passed away, might seek to persuade the world that imperial Egypt, in the days of her high renown, had groped in darkness. Chapter 49. We were at sea now, for a very long voyage. We were to pass through the entire length of the Levant, through the entire length of the Mediterranean proper, and also then cross the full width of the Atlantic, a voyage of several weeks. We naturally settled down into a very slow, stay-at-home manner of life, and resolved to be quiet, exemplary people, and roam no more for 20 or 30 days. No more at least than from stem to stern of the ship. It was a very comfortable prospect, though, for we were tired and needed a long rest. We were all lazy and satisfied now, as the meager entries in my notebook, that sure index to me of my condition, prove. What a stupid thing a notebook gets to be at sea, anyway. Please observe the style. Sunday, services as usual at 4 bells. Services at night also, no cards. Monday, beautiful day, but rained hard. The cattle purchased at Alexandria for beef ought to be shingled, or else fattened. The water stands in deep puddles in the depressions forward of their after shoulders, also here and there all over their backs. It is well they are not cows. It would soak in and ruin the milk. The poor devil eagle, afterwards presented to the Central Park from Syria, looks miserable and droopy in the rain, perched on the forward capstan. He appears to have his own opinion of a sea voyage, and if it were put into language and the language solidified, it would probably essentially dam the widest river in the world. Tuesday, somewhere in the neighborhood of the island of Malta. Cannot stop there. Cholera. Weather very stormy. Many passengers seasick and invisible. Wednesday, weather still very savage. Storm blew 2 land birds to sea, and they came on board. A hawk was blown off also. He circled round and round the ship, wanting to light, but afraid of the people. He was so tired, though, that he had to light at last or perish. He stopped in the foretop repeatedly, and was as often blown away by the wind. At last Harry caught him. Sea full of flying fish. They rise in flocks of 300, and flash along above the tops of the wave, a distance or two of 200 or 300 feet, then fall and disappear. Thursday, anchored off Algiers, Africa. Beautiful city, beautiful green hilly landscape behind it. Stayed half a day and left. Not permitted to land, though we showed a clean bill of health. They were afraid of Egyptian plague and cholera. Friday morning, dominoes. Afternoon, dominoes. Evening, promenading the deck. Afterwards, charades. Saturday morning, dominoes. Afternoon, dominoes. Evening, promenading on the decks. Afterwards, dominoes. Sunday morning, service 4 bells. Evening service 8 bells. Monotony till midnight. whereupon dominoes. Monday morning, dominoes. Afternoon, dominoes. Evening, promenading on the decks. Afterward, charades, and a lecture from Dr. C. Dominoes. No date. Anchored off the picturesque city of Cagliari, Sardinia. Stayed till midnight, but not permitted to land by those infamous strangers. They smell inodorously. They do not wash. They dare not risk cholera. Thursday, anchored off the beautiful cathedral city of Malaga, Spain. Went ashore in the captain's boat. Not ashore either, for they would not let us land. Quarantine. Shipped my newspaper correspondence, which they took with tongs, dipped it in seawater, clipped it full of holes, and then fumigated it with villainous vapors till it smelt like a Spaniard. Inquired about chances to run blockade and visit the Alhambra and Granada. Too risky, they might hang a body. Set sail, middle of afternoon. And so on and so forth for several days. Finally anchored off Gibraltar, which looks familiar and homelike. It reminds me of the journal I opened with the New Year once, when I was a boy, and a confiding and a willing prey to those impossible schemes of reform which well-meaning old maids and grandmothers set for the feet of unwary youths at that season of the year. Setting oversized tasks for them, which, necessarily failing, as infallibly weaken the boy's strength of will, diminish his confidence in himself, and injure his chances of success in life. Please accept of an extract. Monday, got up, washed, went to bed. Tuesday, got up, washed, went to bed. Wednesday, got up, washed, went to bed. Thursday, got up, washed, went to bed. Friday, got up, washed, went to bed. Next Friday, got up, washed, went to bed. Friday fortnight, got up, washed, went to bed. Following month, got up, washed, went to bed. I stopped then, discouraged. Startling events appeared to be too rare in my career to render a diary necessary. I still reflect with pride, however, that even at that early age, I washed when I got up. That journal finished me. I never have had the nerve to keep one since. My loss of confidence in myself in that line was permanent. The ship had to stay a week or more at Gibraltar to take in coal for the home voyage. It would be very tiresome staying here, and so 4 of us ran the quarantine blockade and spent 7 delightful days in Seville, Cordova, Cadiz, and wandering through the pleasant rural scenery of Andalusia, the garden of old Spain. The experiences of that cheery week were too varied and numerous for a short chapter, and I have no room for a long one. Therefore, I shall leave them all out. Chapter 60. 10 or 11 o'clock found us coming down to breakfast one morning in Cadiz. They told us the ship had been lying at anchor in the harbor 2 or 3 hours. It was time for us to bestir ourselves. The ship could wait only a little while because of the quarantine. We were soon on board, and within the hour the white city and the pleasant shores of Spain sank down behind the waves and passed out of sight. We had seen no land fade from view so regretfully. It had long ago been decided in a noisy public meeting in the main cabin that we would not go to Lisbon because we must surely be quarantined there. We did everything by mass meeting in the good old national way, from swapping off one empire or another on the program of the voyage, down to complaining of the cookery and the scarcity of napkins. I am reminded now of one of these complaints of the cookery made by a passenger. The coffee had been steadily growing more and more execrable for the space of 3 weeks, till at last it had ceased to be coffee altogether, and had assumed the nature of mere discolored water. So this person said. He said it was so weak that it was transparent an inch in depth around the edge of the cup. As he had approached the table one morning, he saw the transparent edge by means of his extraordinary vision long before he got to his seat. He went back and complained in a high-handed way to Captain Duncan. He said the coffee was disgraceful. The captain showed his. It seemed tolerably good. The incipient mutineer was more outraged than ever then, and at what he denounced as the partiality shown the captain's table over the other tables in the ship. He flourished back and got his cup and set it down triumphantly and said, "Just try that mixture once, Captain Duncan." He smelt it, tasted it, smiled benignly, then said, "It is inferior for coffee, but it is pretty fair tea." The humbled mutineer smelt it, tasted it, and returned to his seat. He had made an egregious ass of himself before the whole ship. He did it no more. After that, he took things as they came. That was me. The old-fashioned ship life had returned, now that we were no longer in sight of land. For days and days it continued just the same, one day being exactly like another, and to me, every one of them pleasant. At last, we anchored in the open roadstead of Funchal in the beautiful islands we call the Madeiras. The mountains looked surpassingly lovely, clad as they were in living green, ribbed with lava ridges, flecked with white cottages, riven by deep chasms purple with shade. The great slopes dashed with sunshine and mottled with shadows, flung from the drifting squadrons of the sky, and the superb picture fitly crowned by towering peaks, whose fronts were swept by the trailing fringes of the clouds. But we could not land. We stayed all day and looked. We abused the man who invented quarantine. We held half a dozen mass meetings and crammed them full of interrupted speeches, motions that fell stillborn, amendments that came to naught, and resolutions that died from sheer exhaustion in trying to get before the House. At night, we set sail. We averaged 4 mass meetings a week for the voyage. We seemed always in labor in this way, and yet so often fallaciously that whenever at long intervals we were safely delivered of a resolution, it was cause for public rejoicing, and we hoisted the flag and fired a salute. Days passed, and nights, and then the beautiful Bermudas rose out of the sea. We entered the tortuous channel, steamed hither and thither among the bright summer islands, and rested at last under the flag of England, and were welcome. We were not a nightmare here, where were civilization and intelligence in place of Spanish and Italian superstition, dirt and dread of cholera. A few days among the breezy groves, the flower gardens, the coral caves, and the lovely vistas of blue water that went curving in and out, disappearing and anon again, appearing through jungle walls of brilliant foliage, restored the energies dulled by long drowsing on the ocean, and fitted us for our final cruise, our little run of 1,000 miles to New York, America, home. We bade goodbye to our friends the Bermudians, and, as our program hath it, the majority of those we were most intimate with were Negroes, and courted the great deep again. I said the majority. We knew more Negroes than white people, because we had a deal of washing to be done, but we made some most excellent friends among the whites, whom it will be a pleasant duty to hold long in grateful remembrance. We sailed, and from that hour all idling ceased. Such another system of overhauling, general littering of cabins, and packing of trunks we had not seen since we had let go the anchor in the harbor of Beirut. Everybody was busy. Lists of all purchases had to be made out, and values attached, to facilitate matters at the custom house. Purchases bought by bulk in partnership had to be equitably divided, outstanding debts canceled, accounts compared, and trunks, boxes, and packages labeled. All day long the bustle and confusion continued. And now came our first accident. A passenger was running through a gangway between decks one stormy night when he caught his foot in the iron staple of a door that had been heedlessly left off his hatchway, and the bones of his leg broke at the ankle. It was our first serious misfortune. We had traveled much more than 20,000 miles by land and sea in many trying climates without a single hurt, without a serious case of sickness, and without a death among 65 passengers. Our good fortune had been wonderful. A sailor had jumped overboard at Constantinople one night and was seen no more, but it was suspected that his object was to desert, and there was a slim chance, at least, that he reached the shore. But the passenger list was complete. There was no name missing from the register. At last, one pleasant morning, we steamed up the harbor of New York, all on deck, all dressed in Christian garb by special order, for there was a latent disposition in some quarters to come out as Turks, and amid a waving of handkerchiefs from welcoming friends, the glad pilgrims noted the shiver of the decks that told that ship and pier had joined hands again, and the long, strange cruise was over. Amen. Chapter 61. In this place I will print an article which I wrote for the New York Herald the night we arrived. I do it partly because my contract with my publishers makes it compulsory, partly because it is a proper, tolerably accurate, and exhaustive summing up of the cruise of the ship and the performances of the pilgrims in foreign lands, and partly because some of the passengers have abused me for writing it, and I wish the public to see how thankless a task it is to put one's self to trouble to glorify unappreciative people. I was charged with rushing into print with these compliments. I did not rush. I had written newsletters to the Herald sometimes, but yet when I visited the office that day I did not say anything about writing a valedictory. I did go to the Tribune office to see if such an article was wanted, because I belonged on the regular staff of that paper, and it was simply a duty to do it. The managing editor was absent, and so I thought no more about it. At night, when the Herald's request came for an article, I did not rush. In fact, I demurred for a while, because I did not feel like writing compliments then, and therefore was afraid to speak of the cruise, lest I might be betrayed into using other than complimentary language. However, I reflected that it would be a just and righteous thing to go down and write a kind word for the Hajis. Hajis are people who have made the pilgrimage, because parties not interested could not do it so feelingly as I, a fellow Haji, and so I penned the valedictory. I have read it and read it again, and if there is a sentence in it that is not fulsomely complimentary to captain, ship, and passengers, I cannot find it. If it is not a chapter that any company might be proud to have a body write about them, my judgment is fit for nothing. With these remarks, I confidently submit it to the unprejudiced judgment of the reader. Return of the Holy Land Excursionists, the story of the cruise, to the editor of the Herald. The steamer Quaker City has accomplished at last her extraordinary voyage and returned to her old pier at the foot of Wall Street. The expedition was a success in some respects, in some it was not. Originally it was advertised as a pleasure excursion. Well, perhaps. It was a pleasure excursion, but certainly it did not look like one. Certainly it did not act like one. Anybody's and everybody's notion of a pleasure excursion is that the parties to it will of a necessity be young and giddy and somewhat boisterous. They will dance a good deal, sing a good deal, make love, but sermonize very little. Anybody's and everybody's notion of a well-conducted funeral is that there must be a hearse and a corpse, and chief mourners and mourners by courtesy, many old people, much solemnity, no levity, and a prayer and a sermon withal. 3/4 of the Quaker City's passengers were between 40 and 70 years of age. There was a picnic crowd for you. It may be supposed that the other fourth was composed of young girls, but it was not. It was chiefly composed of rusty old bachelors and a child of 6 years. Let us average the ages of the Quaker City's pilgrims and set the figure down as 50 years. Is any man insane enough to imagine that this picnic of patriarchs sang, made love, danced, laughed, told anecdotes, dealt in ungodly levity? In my experience, they sinned little in these matters. No doubt it was presumed here at home that these frolicsome veterans laughed and sang and romped all day, and day after day, and kept up a noisy excitement from one end of the ship to the other, and that they played blind man's bluff or danced quadrilles and waltzes on moonlight evenings on the quarter-deck, and that at odd moments of unoccupied time they jotted a laconic item or two in the journals they opened on such an elaborate plan when they left home, and then scurried off to their whist and euchre labors under the cabin lamps. If these things were presumed, the presumption was at fault. The venerable excursionists were not gay and frisky. They played no blind man's bluff. They dealt not in whist. They shirked not the irksome journal, for alas, most of them were even writing books. They never romped. They talked but little. They never sang, save in the nightly prayer meeting. The pleasure ship was a synagogue, and the pleasure trip was a funeral excursion without a corpse. There was nothing exhilarating about a funeral excursion without a corpse. A free, hearty laugh was a sound that was not heard oftener than once in 7 days about those decks or in those cabins, and when it was heard it met with precious little sympathy. The excursionists danced on 3 separate evenings, long, long ago. It seems an age. Quadrilles of a single set made up of 3 ladies and 5 gentlemen, the latter with handkerchiefs around their arms to signify their sex, who timed their feet to the solemn wheezing of a melodeon. But even this melancholy orgy was voted to be sinful, and dancing was discontinued. The pilgrims played dominoes when too much Josephus or Robbins Hollyland researches or book writing made recreation necessary. For dominoes is about as mild and sinless a game as any in the world, perhaps, except in always the ineffably insipid diversion they call croquet, which is a game where you don't pocket any balls and don't carom on anything of significance, and when you are done, nobody has to pay, and there are no refreshments to saw off, and consequently there isn't any satisfaction whatever about it. They played dominoes till they were rested, and then they blackguarded each other privately till prayer time. When they were not seasick, they were uncommonly prompt when the dinner gong sounded. Such was our daily life on board the ship: solemnity, decorum, dinner, dominoes, devotions, slander. It was not lively enough for a pleasure trip, but if we had only had a corpse, it would have made for a noble funeral excursion. It is all over now, but when I look back, the idea of these venerable fossils skipping forth on a 6 months' picnic seems exquisitely refreshing. The advertised title of the expedition, the Grand Holy Land Pleasure Excursion, was a misnomer. The Grand Holy Land Funeral Procession would have been much better. Much better. Wherever we went, in Europe, Asia, or Africa, we made a sensation, and I suppose I may add, created a famine. None of us had ever been anywhere before. We all hailed from the interior. Travel was a wild novelty to us, and we conducted ourselves in accordance with the natural instincts that were in us, and trammeled ourselves with no ceremonies, no conventionalities. We always took care to make it understood that we were Americans. Americans! When we found that a good many foreigners had hardly ever heard of America, and that a good many more knew it only as a barbarous province away off somewhere that had lately been at war with somebody, we pitied the ignorance of the old world, but abated not a jot of our importance. Many and many a simple community in the Eastern Hemisphere will remember for years the incursion of the strange horde in the year of our Lord 1867, they called themselves Americans and seemed to imagine in some unaccountable way that they had a right to be proud of it. We generally created a famine, partly because the coffee on the Quaker City was unendurable, and sometimes the more substantial fare was not strictly first class, and partly because one naturally tires of sitting long at the same board and eating from the same dishes. The people of those foreign countries are very, very ignorant. They looked curiously at the costumes we had brought from the wilds of America. They observed that we talked loudly at table sometimes. They noticed that we looked out for expenses and got what we conveniently could out of a franc, and wondered where in the mischief we came from. In Paris, they just simply opened their eyes and stared when we spoke to them in French. We never did succeed in making those idiots understand their own language. One of our passengers said to a shopkeeper, in reference to a proposed return to buy a pair of kid gloves, Allons rester tranquille, mais bivy cum Monday. And would you believe it, that shopkeeper, a born Frenchman, had to ask what it was that had been said. Sometimes it seems to me, somehow, that there must be a difference between Parisian French and Quaker City French. The people stared at us everywhere, and we stared at them. We generally made them feel rather small, too, before we got done with them, because we bore down on them with America's greatness until we crushed them. And yet we took kindly to the manners and customs, and especially to the fashions of the various people we visited. When we left the Azores, we wore awful capotes and used fine tooth combs successfully. When we came back from Tangier in Africa, we were topped with fezzes of the bloodiest hue, hung with tassels like an Indian's scalp lock. In France and Spain, we attracted some attention in these costumes. In Italy, they naturally took us for distempered Garibaldians, and set a gunboat to look for anything significant in our changes of uniform. We made Rome howl. We could have made any place howl when we had all our clothes on. We got no fresh raiment in Greece, but they had but little there of any kind. But at Constantinople, how we turned out! Turbans, scimitars, fezzes, horse pistols, tunics, sashes, baggy trousers, yellow slippers. Oh, we were gorgeous. The illustrious dogs of Constantinople barked their underjaws off, and even then failed to do us justice. They are all dead by this time. They could not go through such a run of business as we gave them and survive. And then we went to see the Emperor of Russia. We just called on him as comfortably as if we had known him a century or so. And when we had finished our visit, we variegated ourselves with selections from Russian costumes and sailed away again, more picturesque than ever. In Smyrna, we picked up camel's hair shawls and other dressy things from Persia. But in Palestine, our splendid career ended. They didn't wear any clothes there to speak of. We were satisfied and stopped. We made no experiments. We did not try their costume. But we astonished the natives of that country. We astonished them with such eccentricities of dress as we could muster. We prowled through the Holy Land, from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, a weird procession of pilgrims, gotten up regardless of expense, solemn, gorgeous, green-spectacled, drowsing under blue umbrellas, and astride of a sorrier lot of horses, camels, and asses than those that came out of Noah's Ark after 11 months of seasickness and short rations. If ever those children of Israel and Palestine forget when Gideon's band went through there from America, they ought to be cursed once more and finished. It was the rarest spectacle that ever astounded mortal eyes, perhaps. Well, we were at home in Palestine. It was easy to see that that was the grand feature of the expedition. We had cared nothing much about Europe. We galloped through the Louvre, the Pitti, the Uffizi, the Vatican, all the galleries, and through the pictured and frescoed churches of Venice, Naples, and the Cathedral of Spain. Some of us said that certain of the great works of the old masters were glorious creations of genius. We found it out in the guidebook, though we got hold of the wrong picture sometimes. And the others said they were disgraceful old daubs. We examined modern and ancient statuary with a critical eye in Florence, Rome, or anywhere we found it, and praised it if we saw fit. And if we didn't, we said we preferred the wooden Indians in front of the cigar stores of America. But the Holy Land brought out all our enthusiasm. We fell into raptures by the barren shores of Galilee. We pondered at Tabor, and at Nazareth we exploded into poetry over the questionable loveliness of Esdraelon. We meditated at Jezreel and Samaria over the missionary zeal of Jehu. We rioted, fairly rioted, among the holy places of Jerusalem. We bathed in Jordan and the Dead Sea, reckless whether our accident insurance policies were extra hazardous or not, and brought away so many jugs of precious water from both places that all the country from Jericho to the mountains of Moab will suffer from drought this year, I think. Yet the pilgrimage part of the excursion was its pet feature. There is no question about that. After dismal, smileless Palestine, beautiful Egypt had few charms for us. We merely glanced at it and were ready for home. They wouldn't let us land at Malta, quarantine. They would not let us land at Sardinia, nor at Algiers, Africa, nor at Malaga, Spain, nor Cadiz, nor the Madeira Islands. So we got offended at all foreigners and turned our backs upon them and came home. I suppose we only stopped at the Bermudas because they were in the program. We did not care anything about any place at all. We wanted to go home. Homesickness was abroad in the ship. It was epidemic. If the authorities of New York had known how badly we had it, they would have quarantined us here. The grand pilgrimage is over. Goodbye to it, and a pleasant memory to it, I am able to say in all kindness. I bear no malice, no ill will toward any individual that was connected with it, either as passenger or officer. Things I did not like at all yesterday, I like very well today. Now that I am at home, and always hereafter I shall be able to poke fun at the whole gang if the spirit so moves me to do, without ever saying a malicious word. The expedition accomplished all that its program promised that it should accomplish, and we ought to all be satisfied with the management of the matter, certainly. Bye-bye, Mark Twain. I call that complimentary. It is complimentary, and yet I never have received a word of thanks for it from the Hajis. On the contrary, I speak nothing but the serious truth when I say that many of them even took exceptions to the article. In endeavoring to please them, I slaved over that sketch for 2 hours and had my labor for my pains. I never will do a generous deed again. Conclusion. Nearly 1 year has flown since this notable pilgrimage was ended, and as I sit here at home in San Francisco, thinking, I am moved to confess that day by day the mass of my memories of the excursion have grown more and more pleasant as the disagreeable incidences of travel, which encumbered them, flitted one by one out of my mind. And now, if the Quaker City were weighing her anchor to sail away on the very same cruise again, nothing could gratify me more than to be a passenger, with the same captain and even the same pilgrims, the same sinners. I was on excellent terms with 8 or 9 of the excursionists. They are my staunch friends yet, and was even on speaking terms with the rest of the 65. I have been at sea quite enough to know that that was a very good average, because a long sea voyage not only brings out all the mean traits one has, and exaggerates them, but raises up others which he never expected he possessed, and even creates new ones. A 12 months' voyage at sea would make of an ordinary man a very miracle of meanness. On the other hand, if a man has good qualities, the spirit seldom moves him to exhibit them on shipboard, at least with any sort of emphasis. Now I am satisfied that our pilgrims are pleasant old people on shore. I am also satisfied that at sea on a second voyage they would be pleasanter, somewhat, than they were on our grand excursion, and so I say without hesitation that I would be glad enough to sail with them again. I could at least enjoy life with my handful of old friends. They could enjoy life with their cliques as well. Passengers invariably divide up into cliques on all ships. And I will say here that I would rather travel with an excursion party of Methuselahs than have to be changing ships and comrades constantly, as people do who travel in the ordinary way. Those latter are always grieving over some other ship they have known and lost, and over other comrades whom divergent routes have separated from them. They learn to love a ship just in time to change it for another, and they become attached to a pleasant traveling companion only to lose him. They have that most dismal experience of being in a strange vessel among strange people who care nothing about them, and of undergoing the customary bullying by strange officers and the insolence of strange servants, repeated over and over again within the compass of every month. They have also that other misery of packing and unpacking trunks, of running the distressing gauntlet of custom houses, of the anxieties attendant upon getting a mass of baggage from point to point on land in safety. I had rather sail with a whole brigade of patriarchs than suffer so. We never packed our trunks but twice, when we sailed from New York and when we returned to it. Whenever we made a land journey, we estimated how many days we should be gone and what amount of clothing we should need, figured it down to a mathematical nicety, packed a valise or two accordingly, and left the trunks on board. We chose our comrades from among our old tired friends and started. We were never dependent upon strangers for companionship. We often had occasion to pity Americans whom we found traveling drearily among strangers with no friends to exchange pains and pleasures with. Whenever we were coming back from a land journey, our eyes sought one thing in the distance first, the ship, and when we saw it riding at anchor with the flag apeak, we felt as a returning wanderer feels when he sees his home. When we stepped on board, our cares vanished, our troubles were at an end, for the ship was home to us. We always had the same familiar old stateroom to go to, and feel safe and at peace and comfortable with. I have no fault to find with the manner in which our excursion was conducted. Its program was faithfully carried out, a thing which surprised me, for great enterprises usually promise vastly more than they perform. It would be well if such an excursion could be gotten up every year and the system regularly inaugurated. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. The excursion is ended, and has passed to its place among the things that were, but its varied scenes and its manifold incidences will linger pleasantly in our memories for many a year to come, always on the wing as we were, and merely pausing a moment to catch fitful glimpses of the wonders of half a world. We could not hope to receive or retain vivid impressions of all it was our fortune to see, yet our holiday flight has not been in vain, for above the confusion of vain recollections, certain of its best prized pictures lift themselves and will still continue perfect in tint and outline after their surroundings shall have faded away. We shall remember something pleasant of France and something also of Paris, though it flashed upon us a splendid meteor and was gone again. We hardly knew how or where. We shall remember always how we saw majestic Gibraltar glorified with the rich coloring of a Spanish sunset and swimming in a sea of rainbows. In fancy we shall see Milan again, and her stately cathedral with its marble wilderness of graceful spires, and Padua, Verona, Como jeweled with stars, and patrician Venice afloat upon her stagnant flood, silent, desolate, haughty, scornful of her humbled state, wrapping herself in memories of her lost fleets, of battle and triumph, and all the pageantry of a glory that is departed. We cannot forget Florence, Naples, nor the foretaste of heaven that is in the delicious atmosphere of Greece, and surely not Athens and the broken temples of the Acropolis. Surely not venerable Rome, nor the green plain that compasses her round about, contrasting its brightness with her grey decay, nor the ruined arches that stand apart in the plain and clothe their looped and windowed raggedness with vines. We shall remember St. Peter's, not as one sees it when he walks the streets of Rome and fancies all her domes are just alike, but as he sees it leagues away, when every meaner edifice has faded out of sight, and that one dome looms superbly up in the flush of sunset, full of dignity and grace, strongly outlined as a mountain. We shall remember Constantinople and Bosporus, the colossal magnificence of Baalbek, the pyramids of Egypt, the prodigious form, the benignant countenance of the Sphinx, Oriental Smyrna, sacred Jerusalem, Damascus, the pearl of the East, the pride of Syria, the fabled Garden of Eden, the home of princes and genii of the Arabian Nights, the oldest metropolis on earth, the one city in all the world that has kept its name and held its place and looked serenely on while the kingdoms and empires of 4,000 years have risen to life, enjoyed their little season of pride and pomp, and then vanished and been forgotten.